Three numbers open this story like a bill you can't return. 1713, 1717, 1718. 1713 is when the War of the Spanish Succession ends and the pay stops. Not the speeches, the wages. The Atlantic doesn't demobilize with dignity. It coughs men onto docks and tells them to disappear. Privateers, once patriots for hire, become unemployed violence with sea legs. And the empire, like every empire, refuses to admit it created them. 1717 is when the ocean does what navies struggle to do. It wipes a pirate legend off the map. A single storm off Cape Cod tears the Whydah apart and drops bodies into the surf like punctuation. One day, a captain is a myth. The next, he is driftwood. That matters, because it reveals the real anatomy of piracy. Not romance, not freedom, not even rebellion. Risk management. These men don't love danger. They price it. And when the price spikes, the business collapses. 1718 is when Britain makes the kill feel moral. Not by winning a great battle, by issuing a deadline, a royal pardon. Surrender within the year, and crimes committed before a line in the calendar are washed clean. The empire doesn't just offer mercy, it weaponizes choice. Because a pardon is a trap with a velvet interior. Accept it, and you admit the crown's authority. Reject it, and you mark yourself as irredeemable. That is the big question we're going to drag through salt and smoke. When piracy becomes inconvenient, how does an empire really defeat it? By cannon fire, or by converting law and forgiveness into a machine that makes everyone complicit? Viewer discretion advised. If you care about the historical record, subscribe. When the ledger closes, the bodies still speak. After the war, men flooded places like Nassau in the Bahamas, not because they were born monsters, but because they were suddenly surplus. Merchant empires need predictability, schedules, insurance, freight rates, clean ledgers. Pirates destroy predictability. They don't just steal cargo, they raise the cost of certainty. One captured ship can ripple into higher premiums, delayed convoys, tighter credit, pain that spreads quietly like rot. Nassau becomes the perfect wound in Britain's body, a harbour where stolen sugar and cloth turn into cash, where ex-privateers can pretend they've built a republic. But listen closely. Real republics have courts, taxes, borders, paperwork. Nassau has something darker, a marketplace of fear run by men who understand the empire because they used to work for it. They know how convoys move. They know what panic does to a port. They know how to turn violence into negotiation. And that's why Britain's response isn't simply send ships. Ships can kill pirates. Ships can't kill the conditions that manufacture pirates. So the Crown tries something more sophisticated. It sends a governor, a proclamation, and a moral story the public can repeat without choking. It turns surrender into respectability. It turns resistance into insanity. And soon, the pirates will learn the cruelest rule of power. When the system stops profiting from your chaos, it will rebrand your death as Order, Midnight, April 26th, 1717. Not a duel, not a chase, not a heroic last stand. Just a ship and a sky that decides to turn paperwork into corpses. Samuel, Black Sam Bellamy is sailing the Whydah, heavy with loot, heavy with confidence, heavy with the kind of momentum that makes men start believing their own myth. And then the Atlantic reminds him of a rule: no pirate ever truly escapes. You can intimidate merchants, you can outgun a sloop, you can outwit a governor, but you cannot negotiate with weather. A violent nor'easter claws the sea into hills. The deck becomes a moving trap, ropes snapping, rigging whipping like wire, men losing their footing in the dark. In stories, pirates control the ship with swagger. In reality, a ship in a storm is a factory of small failures. One bad turn of the bow, one missed order, one anchor that bites wrong, and the whole thing becomes physics. Bellamy's crew fights to turn the ship's bow into the wind. They drop anchor. That's the responsible choice. That's what professional looks like at sea. You don't win storms, you survive them. But the anchors start to drag. And that sentence is the moment the legend starts dying. Because when an anchor drags, the ship isn't parked. It's being slowly sentenced. Every second it slips means less water under the keel, less room to maneuver, more certainty that the shoreline isn't a refuge, but a wall. Bellamy orders the anchors cut. That sounds insane until you understand the calculation. An anchor is security, but it's also a chain. In a dragging storm, it can turn your ship into a sled aimed at rocks. So he cuts it, and he orders the helmsman closer to shore, because even if the ship is doomed, maybe the men aren't. That's the part nobody wants to admit. Most pirate brutality is survival math. Even the famous ones spend half their lives making grim compromises with danger. For a moment, it seems like it might work. The beach is there, close enough to imagine a different ending. Then the ship slips stern first over waves described like walls, monstrous swells that don't just lift you, they rearrange you. The Whydah runs aground hard at the foot of cliffs. Men are thrown from rigging into churning black water. Cannons break loose from their tackles. Suddenly, the weapons that made the pirates powerful become rolling boulders of iron, smashing through flesh and wood with the same indifference the storm shows everything. The mainmast comes down. Waves pour over the deck and into the decks below, flooding the ship from the inside like an execution carried out by architecture. By dawn, the hull breaks apart. The sea doesn't sink the Whydah politely. It tears it open and scatters what's inside. Bodies wash ashore. The storm keeps going, as if it's offended anyone believed it would stop simply because enough men had died. Here's what this disaster does to the pirate world. Something quieter than tragedy, but more important than drama. It exposes the lie that piracy is pure choice, because the same post-war economy that pushed men toward Nassau also pushed them onto overloaded ships, into rushed voyages, into riskier routes. Loot changes the physics of a vessel. Heavy cargo changes handling. Storm seasons don't care that you earned your fortune. And the Atlantic trade system, insurance, shipping schedules, port credit, doesn't care that your crew wanted freedom. It cares that the cargo is late, missing, or cursed. So, Bellamy's death isn't just a colourful episode. It's a signal flare to everyone watching the horizon. Pirates are not immortal. They are not even stable. They're a high-yield investment with a catastrophic downside, and that changes how men behave. When a famous captain dies, not under a gallows, but under a storm, the lesson spreads faster than any proclamation. The pirate life doesn't just end in prison. It ends in a ditch of salt water where nobody even knows your name. And that is exactly why what comes next works. Because the Empire doesn't defeat piracy by out-romancing it. It defeats piracy by offering an alternative story to men who have just been reminded how cheaply they can be erased. A deadline, a pardon, a way to step out of the storm and back into paperwork. Nassau is about to split into two kinds of people: those who look at the Whydah and hear a warning, and those who look at it and hear a dare. So ask yourself, if nature can wipe out a pirate king overnight, what does an empire learn from that? Does it double down on cannons? Or does it build a system that makes pirates defeat themselves? Empires don't only kill their enemies. They name them. They file them. They decide which kind of violence counts as work, and which kind must be called crime. And after Bellamy's death, when the ocean had already proved how disposable a pirate could be, Britain chose the cleaner weapon, legality with an expiration date. In September 1717, word went out from King George I, a proclamation, simple, theatrical, and cruel in its elegance. Any pirate who surrendered within the year would receive a full pardon for crimes committed before a specific cut-off date. That detail matters. It's not forgiveness in a religious sense. It's forgiveness in a bureaucratic sense. A line on a calendar becomes a blade. Everything before it can be erased. Everything after, it becomes a future hanging. The Empire offers a way back into society, but only if you confess society owns you. This is how mercy becomes a machine. Because the pardon doesn't just reduce piracy by removing pirates from the sea. It does something deeper. It splits the pirate world into factions and forces every man to choose a public identity. Are you a repentant worker returning to law, or are you an outlaw who refuses even the appearance of submission? Once that question exists, the pirates can't pretend they're a united republic. They become what they always were, a temporary alliance of men with incompatible dreams. In Nassau, the fracture shows instantly. Some pirates, often former privateers who still remember what a commission felt like, see the pardon as a ladder back to legitimacy. Men like Henry Jennings and Benjamin Hornigold understand something uncomfortable. An empire can tolerate violence when it's rentable. Privateering was piracy with a signature. So, if the Crown is offering signatures again, why keep gambling with storms, hunger, and the rope? These moderates don't suddenly grow consciences. They grow calculators. They imagine investing stolen wealth into trade, into property, into respectability, turning the pirate's chaotic profit into the merchant's stable profit. The difference isn't morality, it's risk profile. But another faction hears the pardon as an insult. Charles Vane becomes the face of it in Nassau, embittered, furious, convinced that surrender is not peace, but humiliation. These men don't frame themselves as businessmen. They frame themselves as the knife held to the throat of a world run by elites who hoard the wealth and outsource the killing. In their mind, the pardon isn't a gift, it's a leash. Accept it, and you admit you were never free, only temporarily unmanaged. Reject it, and you can still call your desperation principle. Notice the psychology here. The empire doesn't need to persuade everyone. It only needs to make the pirate world argue about itself until it bleeds cohesion. Every pardon accepted is not just one less enemy at sea. It's a public vote that the Crown's authority is real. Every pardon rejected becomes evidence that violence is the pirate's true nature. Either way, the state wins the story, and Nassau becomes a theatre where that story is rehearsed. Vane's supporters move like a mob because mobs are what you get when a community has no stable institution, only charisma and fear. They march to Fort Nassau and cut down the Union Jack, raised by the pro-pardon faction, then hoist a black flag in its place. It's a gesture meant to look like sovereignty, but it's also an admission. They know symbols matter, because they know how empires rule. A flag is not cloth. It's a claim over how people should feel when they look at you. The island stays tense. A general council meets, not to pass laws, because pirates don't have the infrastructure of law, but to negotiate survival. Vane and his faction argue for fortifying the island and forcing the king to negotiate. That's not insanity. It's a rational extension of what piracy already is: leverage by threat. If merchant empires can be bled through insurance rates and panic, why not bleed the crown itself? Why not transform Nassau from a den into a bargaining chip? Jennings and Hornigold counter with the argument of exhaustion. Fortify with what labor? Feed with what supply chain? Defend against what fleet? Pirates are good at raiding predictable routes. They are terrible at sustaining a state. Their republic has no farms, no factories, no reliable revenue, only plunder. And plunder depends on constant movement. A fortified Nassau is a prison with walls you built yourself. The council breaks without consensus. And that's the real moment the Republic of Pirates dies. Not when Britain arrives, not when cannons fire, but when its people prove they cannot agree on what they are. As the arguments sour, many pirates begin to pack up and leave. Because when an institution can't produce decisions, individuals take their chances elsewhere. This is how a state collapses, not with a battle, but with exit. And into that fracture steps the man designed to exploit it. Woody's Rogers is not coming to Nassau as a romantic hero. He is coming as the Empire's accountant of stability, an ex-privateer turned governor, a man who understands both sides of the knife. He knows pirates speak the language of profit and fear because he has spoken it himself under a legal flag. And he arrives with the two instruments that matter more than any speech: a written commission and the promise that those who kneel will be allowed to stand again. The pardon created the choice. Rogers will enforce the consequences. So here's your open loop, sharpened into a threat. When the royal governor's ships appear in Nassau's harbour, what happens to the men who rejected mercy? Men like Vane, when the exits are watched, the fort is crumbling, and the Empire offers one last chance to sign away your legend. A pirate republic sounds like a joke until you understand what the joke is hiding. It's a labor dispute with cannons. Nassau isn't built on ideology. It's built on men who learned violence under legal contracts and then watched those contracts evaporate. The Empire trained them, paid them, praised them, and then, when peace returned, pretended they were a problem that appeared from nowhere. So, when the king's pardon arrives, it doesn't land like mercy. It lands like a mirror. It forces every pirate in Nassau to look at himself and answer a question he's been avoiding. Am I a worker who lost a job? Or am I a criminal who found a home? That's why the island cracks. The pro-pardon pirates don't speak the language of virtue. They speak the language of exit routes, They know what hangs at the end of this road because many of them have escorted prisoners in chains before. Some were privateers who watched pirates swing while they themselves were congratulated for doing the same thing with the right paperwork. So, when a pardon offers legitimacy, they hear something practical: insurance. They can turn their stolen wealth into shops, plantations, trade licenses, into a life that won't end on a post with crows pecking at their eyes. But the anti-pardon pirates, Vane's men, the hardliners, the ones who have nothing to return to, hear the proclamation as a demand for humiliation. Because surrender isn't just laying down arms, it's accepting the Empire's story about what you are. The pardon doesn't say, "We understand why you did it." It says, "Confess you were wrong, and we will allow you to exist again." That's not reconciliation, that's ownership. And men who have been treated like disposable tools don't want to be owned again. Here's the uglier truth. Both factions are right, and both are trapped. Nassau survives on theft, but theft survives on motion. A pirate harbour is not a city with farms and mills. It is a mouth that must keep biting. Once you stop moving, you start starving. That's why Vane's dream, fortify the island, force the king to negotiate, sounds bold but smells like fantasy. Fortify with what labour, with what engineers, with what steady food supply? The island's population is volatile, drunk, wounded, diseased, ambitious, and constantly looking for the next ship to take. Even if they had the will to build a fortress, they don't have the machinery of a state. They don't have taxation that people accept. They don't have courts that can compel obedience without a gun to the head. They have charisma, intimidation, and the temporary unity of shared profit. And profit is a weak foundation for politics. So the Pirate Council meets, this famous image of outlaw democracy, and what you actually see is a group of men trying to vote their way out of reality. They argue in the open because secrecy is for stable institutions. Nassau is a campfire that could be kicked over at any time. One side says, take the pardon, surrender, convert loot into legitimacy. The other says, resist, build defenses, make the empire pay for every inch. And beneath both arguments is the same terror. Nobody trusts the crown and nobody trusts each other. Because pardon is not only a policy, it is a test of loyalty. The moment one man accepts it, he becomes suspicious to the others. He might be a future informer. He might be a future deputy. He might be the bridge the empire walks across to take the island. And the moment one man rejects it, he becomes a liability to the moderates. He threatens the possibility of a clean deal. He threatens the thin illusion that pirates can retire like merchants. This is how the empire wins without firing a shot. It turns every pirate into a potential traitor. And that's when symbols start getting murdered. Vane's faction storms Fort Nassau and cuts down the Union Jack because they understand, instinctively, what empires understand professionally. Flags are psychological infrastructure. The Union Jack is a claim that the king still owns the island, even when his cannons aren't here. The black flag is the counterclaim, that Nassau answers to fear, not law. But notice what's happened. They are already fighting over imperial symbols. They are already speaking in the empire's visual language. Even rebellion is being conducted on the Empire's terms. Meanwhile, the pro-pardon faction clings to something equally telling: respectability. They don't just want safety. They want to be seen as the reasonable pirates. They want to be the ones history forgives. That hunger is the most exploitable human instinct in politics: the desire to be the good exception. The Empire offers them that identity like bait. As January drags on and arguments rot into resentment, the Republic starts to dissolve the way black markets always dissolve under pressure. People leave. They slip away on small vessels. They take what they can carry. Nassau's unity was never built on a constitution. It was built on convenience. And convenience has a shorter lifespan than courage. By late July, everyone in Nassau knows what's coming. Woodes Rogers, the new royal governor, and a flotilla to back his authority. They also know something worse. There won't be another negotiation after this. The pardon was the soft phase. Now comes the phase where choices become irreversible. On the night the sails appear on the horizon, the island holds its breath. Moderates prepare to welcome the crown like salvation. Hardliners calculate escape routes like cornered animals. And Vane, watching the harbour and the warships moving into position, realizes the most dangerous truth of all. When an empire offers mercy, it isn't asking you to change. It's asking you to be counted. So what does a pirate do when the exits are watched, the fort is crumbling, and the Empire's forgiveness is about to become a cage? On the evening of July 24th, the harbour of Nassau receives the kind of visitor that changes a town's future without needing to fire a shot, an appointment. Woodes Rogers drops anchor with a small flotilla, warships and transports. And suddenly, the pirate capital isn't a rumour anymore. It's a target with coordinates. The timing is surgical. Nassau has already been cracked open by the king's pardon, hollowed by argument, thinned by men slipping away in the night. Now the Empire arrives not as a monster roaring at the gates, but as a clerk walking into an office that's been mismanaged. And the Empire's first move isn't violence, it's theatre. By the time Rogers comes in, the island has its welcoming committee ready. The pro-pardon pirates who want legitimacy more than they want freedom. They don't receive him like an invader. They receive him like the solution to their own fear. And that is the first quiet horror of this story. Power doesn't always conquer you by force. Sometimes it conquers you by making you beg for the cage. 2 days later, on July 26th, Rogers lands ashore. He doesn't stride into Nassau alone like a hero in a painting. He is escorted by soldiers, by men with titles, by the weight of a commission that turns his body into law. And who leads him through the ruins of Fort Nassau? Not a redcoat. Benjamin Hornigold, a pirate, now becoming a guide for empire. That detail is not decorative, it's the blueprint. Because the British Crown doesn't need to beat every pirate. It needs to recruit the right ones. It needs insiders who can translate the island's chaos into an administrative map. Who's influential, who's angry, who can be bought, who can be scared, who can be used. Hornigold leading Rogers through the crumbling fort is a visual confession that Pirate Republic was always a temporary costume. The real architecture underneath it is older, patronage, survival, and the human hunger to be on the winning side when the verdict arrives. Rogers addresses a gathered crowd, about 300 people, in the script's telling, and he reads aloud the king's commission appointing him governor of the Bahamas. again. Not cannons, not blood, paper. The crown performs legitimacy in public because legitimacy is a contagious idea. You don't just govern the island, you teach everyone watching that the island has returned to the Empire's story. Then Rogers begins the consolidation. 100 men from an independent company of British troops take control of Fort Nassau. Control of the fort is control of the harbour. Control of the harbour is control of wood, trade, escape. This is the logistical spine of rule. You don't need to dominate every street if you can dominate the point where life enters and exits. In a makeshift office, Rogers consults with prominent residents to form a governing council. 12 men, according to the script. And this is where the Empire's strategy stops looking like a military operation and starts looking like political psychology. Councils are not just for advice. They are for complicity. Once you sit on the council, you become part of the system you once resisted. Your survival becomes tied to its survival. And if you are an ex-pirate, your future depends on proving you can be useful in the new order. The Empire doesn't merely forgive you, it employs you. That's the conversion process. Outlaw to asset. Rogers knows the island is still dangerous. Charles Vane is not gone. He is merely unaccounted for. Spain remains a threat in the region, and Nassau's fortifications are decayed, its labour unreliable, its morale fractured. But the Crown has bet on a specific kind of victory. Not the clean victory of annihilation, but the ugly victory of administration. Replace the pirate economy with a colonial economy. Replace fear-based authority with rule-based authority. Replace we take with we tax. And to do it, you don't need to win hearts. You need to control incentives. So Rogers sets the trap in plain sight. Those who accept his authority can become respectable. Those who resist will be isolated, cut off from the harbour, cut off from the pardon, cut off from the story the Empire is writing about itself. But empires underestimate something at their peril. Desperation has its own imagination. Because while Rogers reads commissions and builds councils, there is a man watching the warships, watching the harbour mouth, watching the distance between escape and disaster. Vane doesn't need to defeat the Empire. He only needs to slip past it. And if the exit is guarded, then the only thing left is to turn the harbour itself into a weapon. The next move will not be a speech. It will be fire. Charles Vane didn't watch Woody's Rogers arrive and think, I can win this. He thought something more honest. I can't stay here. Because the moment an empire walks into your harbour with paperwork and warships, the game changes. Piracy depends on mobility. Nassau under Rogers becomes a net tightening around the throat of anyone who refuses to be counted. And the harbour is the noose. By the time Rogers' flotilla sits in Nassau, Vane and his crew are already preparing to leave. But they discover the trap every cornered outlaw learns too late. Exits are political. The harbour mouth is guarded by warships, HMS Rose and the sloop Shark in the script's telling. The Empire doesn't need to storm the fort. It only needs to hold the door. That's the logic of maritime power. You don't conquer land first. You conquer movement. So, Vane does what desperate, competent men do when they can't outgun the system. He improvises terror. At 2:00 a.m., he commits to a strategy that is both ancient and brutally modern, turning a ship into a missile. The guns are unloaded. This isn't a battle plan. It's a distraction plan. A fire ship. One pirate remains at the helm long enough to steer the vessel straight toward the anchored British warships, while the rest set the rigging and pitch-soaked decks alight. Then they abandon it. Picture what that looks like in the dark. A floating structure of flame sliding toward you in a narrow harbour, where wind and tide don't care about your discipline. The British crews don't have time to debate. Their order becomes reflex. Men scramble to cut anchors and get underway. You can almost hear the Empire's calm mask crack, because nothing exposes the fragility of a fleet like panic in confined water. And this is why Vane's tactic matters beyond spectacle. It shows that even when the Empire arrives with legality, it still bleeds the same way, through fear. A fire ship doesn't have to hit you to harm you. It forces you to move, to break formation, to reveal how quickly professionalism collapses into survival. The warships narrowly escape the blaze. Vane watches from the deck of his swift sloop, the Catherine, disappointed that he didn't score actual damage, but satisfied that he purchased something more valuable than broken hulls: time. Time to prepare the real escape. Because Vane isn't trying to win the harbour. He's trying to slip out while everyone is still looking at the fire. At 7 p.m, just as the flotilla positions itself at the harbour entrance like a mouth with teeth, Vane weighs anchor and runs. The Catherine darts for the narrow eastern passage. A British sloop gives chase, the buck in the script. Now the scene stops being pirate rebellion and becomes what it truly is: a race between two machines, powered by wind, crew skill, and luck. This is where piracy's myth usually lives: fast ships, bold captains, escape against impossible odds. But if you want the truth, strip away the romance and look at the logistics. A chase at sea is not a duel of heroes. It's geometry. It's sail trim. It's who can keep speed without tearing canvas. It's whether your crew can work lines while exhausted, whether your hull sits deep or light, whether the tide cooperates. The Empire wants you to believe it wins because it is morally right. Vane's escape reminds you it often wins because it is materially superior. More ships, more men, more capacity to make mistakes without dying. And yet, for this moment, the Empire's material advantage doesn't matter. Nassau's eastern entrance is tight. Vane's sloop is built for speed. He rounds the end of New Providence and looses all sails into the wind. Shots are fired. Not because the shots must hit, because shots change psychology. They announce, "I am not captured yet." And the pursuers, gaining, are forced to call off. Vane escapes. You might think this is a victory for piracy. It isn't. It's a victory for Vane's individual survival, and those are not the same thing. The Pirate Republic is collapsing into scattered lives, scattered boats, scattered loyalties. Every man who flees Nassau makes Rogers stronger. Every hardliner who leaves removes the need for a messy internal crackdown. The Empire doesn't have to kill the pirate city. It only has to inherit the empty shell. And that inheritance is the most humiliating kind of conquest, the kind that looks peaceful. Rogers now has Nassau. He has the fort, crumbling but occupied. He has pro-pardon pirates eager to prove they're good. He has a public narrative ready-made, the king offered mercy, and order returned. But Vane's escape is the stain on that narrative. It proves the harbour is not sealed. It proves defiance still has teeth. It proves that even with commissions and councils, the crown's authority can be mocked by one man with a match and a plan. So, Rogers faces a problem that can't be solved with speeches. How do you govern a place where loyalty is temporary, labor is reluctant, disease is waiting, and your enemies can still slip through the cracks? Because now the warships will leave. The fort is still weak, Spain is still watching, and Vane, alive, humiliated, furious, will not fade quietly into retirement. The Empire has entered Nassau, but it hasn't secured it. And the next phase of this story isn't about pirates attacking the Empire. It's about the Empire discovering that order is not a flag you raise. It's an infrastructure you must build, maintain, and bleed for. What happens when the Empire's ships sail away, and Nassau is left with sickness, hunger, resentment, and the knowledge that the most defiant pirate slipped the net? Rogers takes Nassau the way empires prefer to take things, not with a battle, but with a handover. No glorious breach, no cinematic last stand, just a flag replaced, a commission read aloud, and a fort occupied by men who already feel tired. And that is exactly why the next problem hits so hard. Because once the theatre ends, governance begins. And governance is where romantic stories go to die. Rogers doesn't inherit a city. He inherits a wound. Fort Nassau is crumbling, not as a metaphor, but as a physical fact. The walls need repair, the guns need placement, the powder needs discipline. But he has a labor problem that makes every plan sound like a joke told at his expense. Nassau's workforce is made of ex-pirates who have spent years mastering one skill: taking. Now, Rogers needs them to build, haul, dig, reinforce. Work that produces no immediate loot and requires obedience. In pirate culture, obedience is purchased with profit. In imperial culture, obedience is demanded as a duty. Rogers has to convert one into the other, and there is no miracle conversion rate. Even his assets resist him. The pro-pardon pirates welcomed Rogers because they wanted safety, not because they wanted structure. They wanted the crown to erase their crimes, not to assign them daily labor like soldiers. They imagine respectability as a costume you put on. Rogers needs it to be a discipline you live under. That gap between what people think they're agreeing to and what rule actually requires is where colonies fail. And then the island gets sick. An unidentified disease spreads among the Nassau population, and the pattern is politically humiliating. Long-time residents, those who have lived through the tropical cycle, show resistance. The newcomers Rogers brought with him, soldiers, sailors, colonists, collapse in the climate they were sent to civilize. This is the Empire's blind spot. It believes geography is a backdrop. In reality, geography is an active enemy. The tropics don't care about commissions. They don't respect uniforms. They don't salute the Union Jack. They simply test bodies until bodies admit the truth. Rogers himself becomes ill, and by mid-August, he's unable to attend meetings. The governor, the living symbol of restored order, goes absent. That matters because authority is fragile in a place that has recently been governed by charisma and intimidation. If the leader disappears, people don't patiently wait for the bureaucracy to function. They start improvising again. And improvisation is what Nassau does best. Then the food supply tightens. The disease kills off much of the cattle, and suddenly restoring civilization becomes a question of calories. Hunger is the oldest destabilizer on Earth. It doesn't argue, it doesn't debate. It simply forces people to choose between cooperating and stealing. Nassau, built on theft, doesn't become virtuous under pressure. It becomes itself. And as if sickness and hunger weren't enough, the weather turns hostile. Heavy thunderstorms hit the island for weeks. Repairs slow. Morale rots. The fort stays weak. The harbour, the one thing Rogers must control, remains dangerously exposed. Every day that passes is another day Nassau looks less like an imperial possession and more like an expensive embarrassment. This is where the story becomes confrontational, because it forces you to see how empires really function. They sell order, like it's a moral state, like it arrives because the right men showed up with the right flag. But order is actually a supply chain. It is food arriving on time. It is healthy bodies. It is labor that can be compelled. It is pay that gets delivered. It is ships that stay when you need them to stay. And Rogers doesn't have that. Commodore Peter Chamberlain, commanding the naval support that made Rogers' arrival possible, announces his 3 warships are leaving. Why? Because war is looming with Spain again. Ships are needed elsewhere. This is the brutal hierarchy of empire. A colony is never the center. It is always a peripheral investment competing with other emergencies. Nassau exists because it's useful. The moment it becomes expensive, it gets downgraded. Rogers begs him to stay, not negotiates. Not orders, begs, because Rogers has no authority over a Royal Navy Commodore. That's the second humiliation. Even the governor is not sovereign. He is a manager in a system where the real muscle answers to London's priorities, not his survival needs. Chamberlain claims he has no orders to remain. That phrase, no orders, is the empire's coldest weapon. It's how responsibility evaporates while consequences remain. Chamberlain agrees to leave one ship behind for a few weeks. A compromise that sounds reasonable until you realize what it means. Nassau's security is being measured in calendar increments, the same logic as the pardon. Deadlines. Windows. Temporary protections. The empire doesn't commit to safety. It rents it out. On August 16th, the Milford and Shark depart for New York. Nassau watches the sails vanish and understands something the brochures never say. The Crown has restored order on paper, but in reality, the island is now a half-built fort filled with sick men and reluctant laborers. And then, the real threat circles closer. Spanish Guardacosta's vessels, coastal patrol ships, are reported sailing around New Providence, gathering intelligence, not raiding yet, watching, measuring. Because Great Britain has renewed conflict with Spain in the War of the Quadruple Alliance, and Spain has no reason to let Britain stabilize a strategic harbour without trying to tear it back open. Nassau is a chess square, and the pirates were only one phase of its instability. Now it's imperial rivalry again, just with different uniforms. So Rogers' problem expands overnight. He isn't just suppressing an outlaw economy. He's defending an underfed, diseased colony against a foreign power that knows exactly how weak his position is. He must repair a fort with men who don't want to work, while the sea, his road, his lifeline, his threat, keeps delivering storms and spies. This is the pivot you need to feel in your gut. Piracy wasn't defeated because the empire was strong. Piracy was defeated because the empire could afford to keep trying, even when it failed. The pirates couldn't. They had no reserves, no bureaucracy, no legitimacy cushion, just speed and terror. Rogers is trying to manufacture stability out of decay, and he is doing it while his enemies, both pirate and Spanish, still have the one advantage that always humiliates states: the ability to choose when and where to strike. So here's the plot: turn that tightens the throat. While Nassau sickens and the Spanish scout the coast, another pirate, more famous, more calculating, watches the Crown's order campaign and decides he will not be its final exhibit. He will cash out before the net closes. And that pirate is Blackbeard. Blackbeard watches the empire move the way a professional watches weather. He understands something most legends refuse to admit. Piracy is not an identity. It's a phase, a window, a temporary market condition created by war, chaos, and weak enforcement. And when that window starts to close, the smart pirate doesn't fight to the end, he cashes out. That's the difference between Charles Vane and Edward Teach. Vane wants to be a symbol. Blackbeard wants to be a landlord. The king's pardon has already turned Nassau into a moral machine. Accept and become reformed, refuse and become a public lesson. Rogers' arrival proves Britain is serious about reclaiming the narrative. And Rogers' problems, disease, shortages, Spanish scouting, prove something even more important. The empire is not omnipotent. It is stretched. It is improvising. Which means there is still one more moment to strike. One more score large enough to buy a future. So Blackbeard aims at a target that matters not just economically, but psychologically. Charleston, South Carolina. Not a remote schooner on a lonely route. A colony's artery. A port where trade is identity. On May 22nd, 1718, Blackbeard's small fleet arrives off the Charleston Bar, about 9 miles south of the colony. The first move is surgical. Seize the pilot boat before it can raise the alarm. That's not just piracy. That's information control. If the port doesn't know you're there, ships keep coming. Fear spreads slower than greed. And greed is what Blackbeard uses against them. He waits at the approaches and falls on ships like a toll collector. Within days, multiple vessels are captured and looted. But the point isn't simply cargo. The point is to demonstrate, in front of an entire colony, that the empire's order is still negotiable. That the sea still belongs to whoever can make the price of resistance too high. Then Blackbeard escalates, not with more cannons, but with hostages. One captured ship includes prominent passengers bound for London, among them distinguished citizens of Charleston. That's the lever. You can replace stolen sugar. You can't replace reputations so easily. When a pirate seizes ordinary sailors, a governor can delay. When a pirate seizes the colony's visible people, delay becomes humiliation. The colony becomes a stage, and the governor becomes the actor forced to speak the pirate's lines. Blackbeard's demand is blunt and revealing. A ransom in the form of a chest of medical supplies. Not gold, not jewels. Medicine. That detail is political poison because it reframes the whole event. This isn't a pirate screaming for treasure. It's a pirate presenting himself as a commander managing a crew. It is piracy dressed as governance. And it exposes an ugly truth about the Atlantic world. Survival resources, food, medicine, repair, are often worth more than luxury when you're operating beyond the safety net. Governor Robert Johnson agrees immediately. Of course he does. The empire's local face cannot afford a public spectacle of refusal when the hostages are the colony's own. The chest of medicines is delivered with a message offering to pardon Blackbeard if he lays down his arms. And here you see the empire trying to reuse its Nassau weapon, mercy as a leash. But Blackbeard reads it correctly. A pardon is not an embrace, it's a receipt. He rejects the offer, yet he keeps to the ransom terms, releasing the captives and their vessels. That restraint is not kindness, it's strategy. Blackbeard is constructing a reputation that will help him later. He wants to be feared, yes, but feared as someone who keeps bargains. Because a pirate who breaks bargains invites scorched earth retaliation. A pirate who keeps them can claim later that he was a businessman pushed outside the law. That distinction is how men survive the transition from outlaw to respectable criminal. After Charleston, Blackbeard moves on quickly. 6 days later, his ships turn into Topsail Inlet along North Carolina's coast. The geography here matters. Inlets, shoals, and swampy coasts are not scenery. They are defensive systems for people who don't control fortresses. They are natural labyrinths designed to punish strangers, especially big naval ships. A pirate who understands shallow water is a pirate who understands how to make empire clumsy, but the coast doesn't care about your reputation. While navigating uncharted shoals, Blackbeard's flagship, the Queen Anne's Revenge, runs onto sand. The ship lists, takes on water, and the crew's attempts to drag her free fail. And again, the lesson repeats from the Whydah. Piracy is a business that collapses not only under law, but under logistics. One grounded hull can erase months of power. A big ship is intimidating until it becomes stuck. With the flagship doomed, the pirates transfer to other vessels. And now Blackbeard performs the most revealing move of his career. He turns on his own ecosystem. Stede Bonnet, the gentleman pirate, the man whose very nickname is an insult to the social order, becomes a tool. Blackbeard announces he will give command back to Bonnet and sends him ashore toward Beaufort to seek a pardon immediately, promising to return for the rest later. It sounds like generosity. It is not. It's a purge disguised as trust. Once Bonnet is gone, Blackbeard's men seize Bonnet's shipmates and strand 16 of them on a sandy, uninhabited island off the mainland. More men are left behind. Hundreds are abandoned at Beaufort as Blackbeard and a chosen inner circle take a captured Spanish sloop and sail away. This is the real horror beneath the Blackbeard myth. Not the beard, not the smoke, not the intimidation tricks. The horror is how quickly an outlaw republic becomes a dictatorship of scarcity. When the ship is lost and the net is tightening, loyalty becomes a luxury. Blackbeard doesn't need a large crew anymore. A large crew is witnesses. A large crew is mouths to feed. A large crew is future informants when the empire starts offering pardons and money. So he shrinks the circle. He deletes the liabilities. Then he goes to Bath, the capital of North Carolina, and surrenders to Governor Charles Eden, sweetened by bribery according to the script's framing. And just like that, piracy reveals its most poisonous secret. Legality is sometimes not earned by virtue, but purchased by proximity and profit. A pirate doesn't have to defeat the state if he can rent pieces of it. Over the summer, Blackbeard moves between Bath and his favourite anchorage at Ocracoke Inlet, and the coast becomes his quiet kingdom. He is no longer a pirate in the theatrical sense. He is a man trying to launder violence into normal life, using the Empire's own language of pardons and official favours to do it. And that creates a problem no amount of paper can hide. If Blackbeard can buy peace in one colony, what stops every port official from doing the same? Where does order end and corruption begin, if the same state that calls you criminal can also sell you a signature? Because someone is watching. And unlike Eden, he is not planning to profit from Blackbeard's retirement. The next hunter won't arrive with a pardon. He'll arrive with jurisdiction-breaking force, and a need to make an example so loud the coastline remembers it. Blackbeard doesn't vanish after Charleston. He mutates. That's what makes him dangerous. A man with a black flag is easy to hate. A man with a pardon is harder, because now the crime is wearing the state's perfume. In Bath, North Carolina's small capital, Blackbeard plays the part the Empire claims it wants, the reformed man stepping back into society. He surrenders to Governor Charles Eden and receives the kind of protection that doesn't look like protection until you see what it allows. He can anchor, he can trade, he can walk into taverns and be treated not as prey, but as a local power. The rumour, repeated in the period and amplified afterward, is bribery, gifts, shares, influence, because that's how frontier governance often works when London is far away and everyone is underpaid. Whether you call it corruption or pragmatism, the result is the same. The state becomes a shelter for the man it claims to outlaw. And Blackbeard understands shelter better than anyone. He doesn't need Nassau anymore. Nassau is politics and crowds and governors under pressure. North Carolina is quieter. The coast is a maze of inlets and shallow water that punishes large warships and rewards local knowledge. Ocracoke Inlet becomes his favourite anchorage because it is a natural gate, tight, tricky, and perfect for controlling who comes and who leaves. A pirate who owns an inlet doesn't need a fortress. He needs patience. Over that summer of 1718, he moves between Bath and the Outer Banks, creating something uglier than a pirate hideout. A pirate-friendly ecosystem. Not a republic of open defiance, but a network of permissions. Supplies can be bought. Captured goods can be quietly reintroduced into the economy. Men can melt into the coastline. The black flag becomes less necessary when the local officials look the other way. This is how outlaw economies survive. Not by fighting the state head-on, but by persuading small parts of it to cooperate. That's the pivot the Empire cannot tolerate, because the Crown can hunt pirates at sea for decades and still lose the real war if the ports quietly absorb them. If a pirate can be laundered into legitimacy by a governor's signature, then piracy stops being an external threat and becomes an internal infection, one that spreads through incentives, not ideology. The Empire's story, law versus chaos, begins to collapse. It starts to look like law versus law, pardon versus pardon, colony versus colony. And while Blackbeard is building this quiet sanctuary, the man he discarded is learning what it means to be discarded. Stede Bonnet, the gentleman pirate, returns. Expecting a reunion that was never planned, he finds absence, betrayal, and a reputation already poisoned. That's the deeper cruelty of Blackbeard's choices on the shoals. He doesn't just abandon men physically, he abandons them narratively. Bonnet is left holding the role of pirate leader, without the resources, without the cohesion, without the fear Blackbeard used as currency. He is a man trying to run an outlaw operation with the wrong kind of charisma. And the sea punishes amateurs faster than it punishes criminals. Bonnet's crew, reduced, stressed, hunted, tries to keep operating. But the Atlantic coast is now alert. Governors share rumors. Merchants pay attention. And by late September, the Empire's net tightens around the weak target first. Bonnet and his men are captured near the mouth of the Cape Fear River on September the 27th. In the Empire's logic, this is not simply a success. It is a rehearsal, a test of how quickly a colony can turn capture into deterrence. Bonnet's fall matters for another reason. It proves that retirement is a lie. Not just for pirates, for everyone in their orbit. Blackbeard's vision of cashing out depends on one fragile condition, that his past can be sealed behind a signature. But signatures are political. They can be revoked, challenged, overridden by other colonies that don't benefit from your peace. And someone is already furious. Virginia's governor, Alexander Spotswood, doesn't see Blackbeard as a local inconvenience. He sees him as an insult. Blackbeard is operating close enough to Virginia's trade lanes to threaten its economy, and he's doing it behind the mask of North Carolina's protection. That is the kind of problem that makes imperial officials do something revealing. They stop caring about the rules when the rules fail to produce the outcome they want. Because here is the uncomfortable truth at the center of this chapter. If Spotswood respects colonial jurisdiction, Blackbeard survives. If Spotswood accepts that each colony polices its own waters, Blackbeard becomes a precedent. Proof that a pirate can buy asylum by choosing the right coastline. And once that precedent exists, every governor becomes a potential Eden. Every inlet becomes a potential Nassau. So Spotswood begins to plan something that will sound like justice and function like invasion. He starts talking to Royal Navy captains. He starts arranging men. He starts acquiring vessels, small enough to navigate shallow water, fast enough to corner a pirate in his own maze. And in doing so, he steps into the exact hypocrisy the Empire never confesses. The Crown will preach law while breaking it, because order is not a principle, it is a result. And if the result requires bending the map will bend. Meanwhile, Blackbeard sits in his sanctuary, tasting the sweetness of legitimacy and believing, perhaps he has escaped the story that ends in a noose. He has a governor's favor. He has a coastal labyrinth. He has fewer men who might betray him. He has what Nassau never offered, quiet. But quiet is not safety. Quiet is the sound you hear before a net drops. So here's the open loop that pulls us forward. When one colony's governor protects a pirate, and another governor decides to hunt him anyway, what wins? Paper borders, or the Empire's need to make an example so brutal that pardon becomes meaningless? Stade Bonnet dies the way the Empire prefers its enemies to die. Not privately, not mercifully, but usefully. The gentleman pirate is a gift to colonial authority because he collapses the pirate myth into a courtroom farce. He isn't a hardened dockside veteran with a lifetime of hunger behind his eyes. He's an educated landowner who tried to wear piracy like a costume. Proof, to the Empire's mind, that crime is not a condition but a choice. and choices deserve punishment. That is why Bonnet's capture in late September 1718 matters beyond one man. It gives the colonies a body they can convert into a lesson. Charleston, still sore from Blackbeard's blockade months earlier, becomes the perfect stage. The port remembers the humiliation of hostages and medicine ransom. Merchants remember the smell of panic. Governors remember how quickly order becomes theatre when the audience is watching. Now they get the opposite performance. Not a pirate controlling the coast, but the state controlling the pirate. Bonnet's trial is not only a legal proceeding, it's an inventory of power. Names are read, acts are catalogued. The state turns violence into paperwork and then uses the paperwork to justify more violence. That's the ritual. That's the point. A pirate raid is a shock, fast, loud, expensive. A pirate trial is a slow sermon. It teaches everyone in the room which side of the world is allowed to hurt people and still call itself civilization. And then comes the end that colonies understand better than kings: the noose. Bonnet is hanged in Charleston in December 1718, and the execution isn't merely justice. It's a public pricing signal. The Empire is telling sailors and dockworkers and drifting privateers, this market is closing. The profit margin is collapsing. What used to be tolerated under wartime commissions is now punished under peacetime law. You can almost feel the shift in incentives. The same men who once admired privateers now look at pirates and see a risk they can't afford to associate with. Fear spreads faster than morality ever does. This is how piracy is defeated at scale, not by killing the strongest pirate first, but by killing the weakest link loudly enough that everyone starts calculating. The colonies don't need to execute every pirate. They need to make a handful of executions so public, so humiliating, that the ocean itself begins to feel like a workplace with cameras. And the camera is the crowd, because the crowd is the real instrument. A state without a crowd is just a gang with uniforms. When people gather to watch a hanging, they aren't just watching a death, they are rehearsing obedience. They are participating in the claim that the law is real. Even those who hate the governor still learn the lesson. The state can place your body on a schedule and keep the schedule. Bonnet's death also does something darker. It clears the moral fog. It makes it easier for officials to say, pirates are monsters, because the executed pirate is no longer a complicated living man. He is a simplified symbol. And once pirates become symbols, the empire can escalate without needing to explain itself. It can say, we are protecting trade. It can say, we are protecting families. It can say, we are restoring order. All true in the narrow sense, and all convenient in the deeper sense, because order is how the empire launders its own violence. Now look at the chain reaction. Charleston hangs pirates, and other ports learn the script. Courts harden, patrols increase, informants suddenly become valuable. Governors who were once tempted to wink at smuggling start fearing that today's bribe will become tomorrow's evidence. The state doesn't just punish pirates, it disciplines officials, merchants, and sailors into a new consensus. Piracy is no longer a tolerated leak in the system. It's a threat to the system's legitimacy. And that's why Blackbeard becomes unbearable. Because Bonnet's hanging doesn't end piracy. It sharpens the contradiction. Blackbeard is not swinging from Charleston's gallows. He is sitting in North Carolina under the shelter of a governor's favor. acting like a man who has found a loophole in empire itself. He is what Bonnet was not: competent, terrifying, politically corrosive. If a gentleman can be hanged for piracy while a true pirate can bargain his way into semi-legality, then the law stops looking like law and starts looking like a marketplace. The empire can survive crime. It cannot survive the idea that crime can be negotiated into respectability. And Virginia's governor, Alexander Spotswood, understands that instinctively. He has watched Blackbeard's shadow distort the coastline for months. He has heard the rumors, seen the nervous shipping, felt the economic drag that piracy creates even when no shots are fired. And now he watches Bonnet die, watches the colonies prove they can perform punishment, while Blackbeard remains alive, nearby, protected by another colony's politics. So Spotswood makes a decision that reveals the final truth about imperial order. When borders protect embarrassment, borders become optional. He begins planning a hunt that will not politely respect jurisdiction. He starts calling on Royal Navy assistance. He starts assembling small vessels suited to shallow water. In other words, he prepares to break the rules to prove the rules still matter. And here's your plot turn, sharpened into a threat. If a governor is willing to invade another colony to kill one man, what does that tell you about the big question we started with? Was piracy defeated by naval strength, or by a legal theatre so ruthless that even the empire's own laws become expendable? Alexander Spotswood doesn't hunt Blackbeard because he's sentimental about the law. He hunts him because Blackbeard is an accounting problem that keeps reappearing on Virginia's balance sheet. A pirate anchored in North Carolina isn't just North Carolina's problem when the trade lanes feed everyone. One rumor of Blackbeard near an inlet can raise freight rates, slow departures, spook crews, and turn merchants into lobbyists. Piracy is a tax that doesn't need a parliament. It's a cost that spreads quietly through insurance, delay, and fear, until every port feels poorer. Spotswood is a governor, yes, but he is also a manager of colonial confidence, and confidence is what Blackbeard keeps puncturing. Worse, Blackbeard is puncturing it while wearing something like legitimacy, a governor's favor, a pardon story, a protected anchorage. It's not that Spotswood believes Eden is innocent. It's that the existence of Eden's shelter makes the entire imperial story wobble. If one colony can domesticate a pirate for profit, then piracy stops being a monster outside the gates and becomes a parasite inside the walls. That's intolerable. Not because empires can't handle crime, but because empires can't handle contagion. The idea that law itself can be rented, that authority can be bought, that the line between outlaw and official is simply who signs the paper. So Spotswood decides to do what states always do when their ideals get embarrassed by reality. He breaks the rules in order to prove the rules still matter. His plan is simple and ugly, a two-pronged strike. One force will pressure Blackbeard's political shelter at Bath, the other will seal the physical shelter at Ocracoke. It's not just a manhunt, it's a systems attack. Cut the pirate off from his governor and cut him off from his escape routes. If Blackbeard is trying to launder violence into legality, Spotswood intends to destroy the laundromat. To do it, he needs the Royal Navy. He meets with Navy captains and asks for help. That request is revealing because it exposes the true hierarchy. Colonial governors speak about law, but the Empire's enforcement muscle lives in naval command. Spotswood can't simply order ships into action. He must bargain for cooperation. And the bargain, in a world of prize money and reputation, isn't always moral. It's transactional. Capture a pirate, and there is glory, reward, and political cover. Fail, and you look weak. But there's a problem even bigger than persuading the Navy: jurisdiction. Spotswood's expedition is, in plain terms, not cleanly legal. Virginia has no simple right to invade North Carolina and conduct a military operation in another colony's territory. Even if you hate Blackbeard, the precedent is toxic. If one governor can cross borders with armed men because he claims public safety, then colonial boundaries become suggestions. Yet Spotswood goes forward anyway, because the empire's greatest hypocrisy is also its greatest advantage. It can violate its own rules and survive the scandal. Pirates cannot. He funds 2 small vessels, sloops, fit for shallow waters. This is the part most people miss when they romanticize the hunt. Spotswood isn't sending a big warship to smash a pirate. He's adapting to the environment, adopting the pirate's logic: shallow draft, speed, local navigation. Empire learns faster than legend wants to admit. When it needs to win, it imitates. Command of the sloops goes to Lieutenant Robert Maynard, a Navy officer who understands the brutal math of this assignment. He is not being sent to duel a villain in open water. He is being sent into inlets and shoals, where a single mistake can strand you under cannon range like a nailed-down animal. The expedition leaves from the Virginia coast on November 17th, heading down past familiar waters into the uncertain throat of the Carolina shoreline. Alongside this, a second force moves overland, men traveling through countryside toward Bath, arriving days later. That overland movement matters psychologically. It tells North Carolina's officials, you are being watched and your protection has limits. It turns Eden's quiet arrangement into a public pressure point. Even if Maynard never fired a shot, the message would still land. The Empire will not tolerate a colony that becomes a pirate's warranty. Now picture what this looks like from Blackbeard's side. You're anchored in a favorite inlet, confident in your maze of shallow water, confident in your reduced inner circle, confident that your past has been softened by a governor's favor. And then you start hearing whispers. Virginia is moving. The Navy is moving. Men are coming by land and sea. The coastline itself seems to tighten. This is where the Empire's true method becomes clear. It doesn't just kill pirates, it isolates them first, economically, socially, and psychologically. It makes their networks feel unreliable. It makes their shelters feel temporary. It makes every ally wonder if the alliance is worth the price of being next. And it forces the pirate into the position pirates hate most, being predictable. Because once you're cornered in a known inlet, your legend becomes geography. The Empire can plan around you. It can choose the timing. It can set the stage. The pirate, who once chose targets at will, becomes the target. So, Maynard sails toward Ocracoke. Scouts and rumor do the rest. The night before the confrontation, Blackbeard's men drink and celebrate by shore fires, because men who live under constant threat sometimes cope by pretending threat is not real. Meanwhile, Maynard watches, waits, and prepares to attack at daylight. And here is the open loop, sharp enough to cut. When the Empire finally closes in, will it win because it is righteous? Or because it is willing to become pirate-like in its own tactics, breaking rules, bending borders, and turning a man's head into a public receipt? The trap finally closes. The way traps usually close in history, not perfectly, not cleanly, but close enough that the story can be sold as order restored. On the afternoon of November the 21st, 1718, Maynard's 2 sloops reach Ocracoke and spot 2 vessels behind the island. One matches the description of Blackbeard's ship. The sun is already sliding down, and Maynard refuses a night assault, not because he's merciful, but because darkness is where pirates are strongest. Night is their native element, confusion, misdirection, the sudden knife. So he waits. He chooses daylight because daylight creates witnesses, and witnesses are what empires use as mortar. Blackbeard's crew parties on shore beside bonfires. That detail isn't just colour, it's psychology. Men who live under constant threat learn to anesthetize themselves. Celebration becomes denial. Rum becomes permission to pretend tomorrow won't arrive. And then morning arrives anyway. At 9:00 a.m. on November 22nd, Maynard sails straight toward Blackbeard's ship with the blunt intent to board quickly, before the pirate crew can fully organize. Immediately, the coastline itself intervenes. Hyde's Ranger runs aground on a sandbar. Maynard's Jane follows, grounding too. The Empire's vessels, sent to deliver a clean lesson, become stuck in the very geography Blackbeard chose as his sanctuary. This is the humiliating truth about naval power. It is only powerful where it can move. Take away movement, and a ship becomes a floating coffin. Blackbeard's crew reacts fast, rushing from shore to their vessel, getting underway as the attackers struggle. Hyde finally gets Ranger free and charges in, but when he comes within range, Blackbeard's guns speak first. A broadside rips across Ranger's foredeck, killing Hyde and scattering the rest into panic and blood. In that moment, the pirate looks like the winner again. Not because he is morally right, but because he is operating on home ground. He knows these waters. He knows where big mistakes happen. A musket shot hits the line holding the pirate ship's foresails, slowing her. It's a small accident with enormous consequence. Not the heroism of empire, but the luck of combat. Maynard gets Jane afloat, rows into range, and closes for boarding. Blackbeard answers with grape shot that kills and wounds men on Jane. Enough carnage to make the deck feel like a slaughterhouse. Here is the Empire's dilemma in its purest form. To defeat piracy, it must step into the pirate's preferred violence. Close quarters, sudden death, bodies at arm's length. And then comes the most cynical genius of the entire hunt. Maynard hides his uninjured men in the hold. This is the Empire adapting. This is the Empire learning to lie like a pirate. Blackbeard sees a sloop full of wounded and assumes the fight is already won. He pulls alongside to board, believing he's about to finish it in one brutal rush. He is not just fighting a ship, he is fighting a performance. Maynard has staged weakness to buy a moment where numbers will matter more than courage. Blackbeard boards first. Maynard springs from the hold with sword drawn, followed by sailors who had been concealed like a knife under a coat. The fight becomes intimate and ugly. Steel meets steel. Pistols flash. The two commanders clash in a duel that every later storyteller will polish into legend. Because legend is what we use to make violence feel like meaning. But the reality is simpler. Blackbeard is outnumbered. Accounts describe him taking multiple gunshot wounds and many sword cuts before collapsing. In the churn of bodies, a final heavy blow takes his head. It is not romantic. It is not noble. It is an execution performed by crowding. The battle ends fast, minutes, not hours. Because once boarding happens with superior numbers, the outcome is often predetermined. Some of Blackbeard's men die there in the crush. Others are captured and later dragged through the Empire's machinery of courts and punishment. Either way, the pirate sanctuary is shattered. Ocracoke, once a maze designed to protect him, becomes the place where his choices finally run out. And then the Empire does what it came to do. It turns death into policy. Maynard strings Blackbeard's head from the bowsprit, not because it is necessary for navigation, but because it is necessary for narrative. The head is a receipt, a proof of purchase, a message to every sailor who still dreams of Nassau. This is the price of refusing the crown's story. And when Maynard returns to Virginia, the head is displayed again, set on a pole at Hampton Roads, so that fear can be shared by people who never saw the battle. The Empire doesn't simply kill the man, it distributes his corpse as information. Now the big question resolves itself, and it's uglier than the romantic version. Piracy was not defeated by one heroic battle or one brilliant governor. It was defeated by a system that made piracy socially, legally, and psychologically unlivable. First, the Crown used a pardon to split the pirate world and recruit insiders. Then it used governors like Rogers to replace pirate economies with colonial administration, commissions, councils, garrisons, work. When that wasn't enough, it tolerated hypocrisy, officials who bent rules, borders that were violated, an illegal expedition launched because embarrassment demanded a trophy. Finally, it sealed the lesson with spectacle, because the public must be taught not just that pirates can die, but that pirates will be displayed. That is how empires win, not by being pure, but by being consistent in their incentives. They offer a way out for the compliant. They punish the defiant publicly. And they make everyone else complicit, simply by watching and nodding. The aftermath is almost anticlimactic, which is the final insult to pirate mythology. Rogers keeps struggling in Nassau against disease, shortages, labor resistance, and foreign threats. He doesn't get a triumph, he gets debt. Other pirates fall, Vane captured and executed, Rackham following. And within a few years, the Caribbean is still dangerous, but no longer possessed by that same concentrated dread. The Golden Age ends the way eras often end, not with a clean finish, but with the slow disappearance of a profitable condition. Then, in 1724, the last transformation happens, maybe the most powerful of all. Pirates become literature. A general history of the pirates gives the public a packaged version of what they feared. Names, archetypes, dramatic scenes, a myth you can consume safely. The Empire doesn't just defeat pirates, it inherits them. It turns them into entertainment, which is the final form of control, to make yesterday's terror into today's story. So remember the ledger we opened with. When the ledger closes, the bodies still speak, but empires learn to translate that speech into a warning and then into a product.